is to create a program that has never existed here before, which introduces children into the world of learning in a very joyful way and makes them understand that they can achieve anything that they want to in the future.
Our kids have to share something. Let them share not Terminator, not Rambo, which is now the case, but Sesame Street.
Puppets. So, Natasha, thank you so much for being here. It's such a pleasure to be in conversation with you this evening.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it's a great honor to be here with you and the Zoom audience. And I wanted to thank the library for this incredible honor to come to Paris. And I had so much help and support from Alice, and wanted to thank Audrey for making this talk possible. And thank you also, Edward, for making time to moderate. So really appreciate that.
So let's jump right into it. There's a scene at the beginning of your book where it's like spring of 1993, and you're on a plane going into Moscow, and it's the craziest scene. So in the plane with you are like these Ivy League finance bros out to make a quick buck in the new capitalist order. And then there's this other crowd of basically missionaries, people from different churches and denominations out to make converts. And then there's you with this idea to make a children's TV show. So maybe you could start by just telling us how you got to be in that plane.
It's really important to set the scene. So this is actually, just a couple of years after the Soviet Union has collapsed. And you have all of these former republics that are breaking off, like Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, and becoming independent countries. So I had already spent a decade in the Soviet Union making films and TV news for ABC, NBC, and documentary films for PBS. And the last film I had shot was called Russia for Sale, The Rough Road to Capitalism. And it came out I finished it in 1991, and it actually predicted the coup that happened in August and was on air on television on primetime evening news that night of the coup. And
Alongside Swan Lake.
Yes, along with Swan Lake on Russian television. So, I had experience working in Russia, and, had just come from embedding myself for the past 2 years with hardline communist, what I thought of as really quite fascistic people. And then these two executives come up to me from Sesame Street. They came to watch the show, and they said, we're trying to bring the Muppets to Moscow, and could you help us? And I just looked at them and I said, did you just watch my film? So I was really in shock, because of course I knew Sesame Street, loved Sesame Street, even though I had not grown up on it because it had come out after I was in preschool. But, I was really intrigued by the prospect of what they were trying to do. And I went down to the studio, which is in Manhattan across from Lincoln Center. And there were all these, very idealistic young people. And this idea was that the Sesame Street would work with the US Congress and with then Senator Biden. And he and the Sesame Street envisioned that the Muppets would be the best ambassadors for idealistic values, to model skills that young children would need to thrive in post-communist society, not only in Russia, but across 11 time zones, which was the idea that we would distribute this show on Russia's largest TV channel, ORT, and then it would go all across the former Soviet Union. So that's how this all started. And
if I could just pick up there, I mean, would you say that Sesame Street was kind of seen in the context of democracy building? Was that like part of what got Congress interested, Senator Biden interested?
Absolutely. I mean, there were so many NGOs over there that were trying to essentially teach what is a civil society, and how do you develop democracy in a country that has been experiencing a command economy and communism for 70 years. And I have to say that, as ambitious as this was, and as euphoric as Western politicians were, we were incredibly naive at that time. And, the whole idea of shock therapy, economic shock therapy, like, we're going to build democracy overnight. And the idea, there was a tremendous hubris as well, because of this idea that, that we actually knew how to do that and we were able to help them. So in that sense, I think part of why I wanted to write this book is precisely to talk about what happened when you try to bring a show like Sesame Street to Russia and adapt it in such a way that it's going to reflect Russian culture, post-Soviet society, that they're going to build their own new Muppets, based on their own folklore and culture, that their neighborhood is going to be based on either what they imagine to be, what do they imagine? Well, that we're going to talk about a little bit later,
definitely. But I think just to pick up on something you said, there was clearly idealism on the American side. But I think it's also interesting to note, and it comes up in the trailer, that you have Russians also talking about the importance of bringing Sesame Street to Russia, or at least programs like Sesame Street, which could give new educational and other values to spectators. So it was a kind of, you were also being pulled there, and it was there are certainly hands reaching towards you, I guess, as you were moving across.
Very, very much so. I mean, it wasn't like Disney or some other American companies that were over there, like many of the very cocky recent MBA graduates that I met on the plane, where they were mostly thinking about post-communist Russia as a giant market, hungry for products. And, we were working with the Ministry of Education, and they didn't have any textbooks. They couldn't use the same materials that they had been using under communism, and they were developing new content for their schools and preschools. So they really wanted us to try to work with their educators and develop a TV show which they hoped, could model a new society for young children and families. And then, what they dreamed of is that they could have that kind of impact in real life. First, they would see it on television, and then it would happen in real life.
Okay, so let's talk about what you encountered when you first got to Moscow, because I think it's fair to say that already the economic environment, as you've indicated, was one of incredible flux, as the Russian Federation had only been founded barely months before. There was this enormous geoeconomic transition to capitalism that was happening and transitioning away from communism. And then, within your particular industry, there's a huge amount of flux and and danger, as the trailer indicated. And could you tell us some of the issues that came up when you were trying to strike a broadcast deal, for instance, at the beginning?
Yeah, I mean, this was a period of, tremendous joy for many Russians who were excited at having new freedoms that they really hadn't had before. And at the same time, it was a period of intense humiliation at seeing their superpower imploding. It was also a time of economic hardship, lawlessness, and violence. And even though I had been in the Soviet Union for, a long time before that, I did not expect to encounter the kinds of things that that happened. So in the beginning, we had to match the U.S. congressional funding with Russian funding. And the American politicians wanted the Russians to have skin in the game, essentially. And our first sponsor, we talked to him about the show. We explained that we'd be providing training and we'd be making a show that was sensitive to their own culture. And he agreed to become the financial backer for the program. And he actually, 3 weeks later, was blown up in a car bombing. And he survived that. But he later, he was not interested in talking about a puppet show after that. He had bigger problems to worry about. And then our broadcaster, there's the gentleman you saw in the book trailer, Vlad Listyev, was a great man trying to create a free press in Russia. And he was our confidant. I mean, he was helping me navigate this feudalistic, very, as you say, in flux, terrifying TV industry where advertising hadn't existed before, which is, it's hard to even fathom when you think about where advertising was in America at this time. So there were a lot of people from the mafia involved in advertising. And, one night leaving the studio at Russia's TV station, he was assassinated and he was dead. And the same thing happened with the next head of the TV station. And this is Oleg Slabyenko, and he also was gunned down. And that was about 9 months later. So we actually produced the entire TV series, so 52 half hours of television without a broadcaster. And we didn't have a broadcaster until well after we were finished with the production.
Yeah, I mean, and there are just so many surreal scenes that happen as you're trying to get this show done in this incredible environment of gangster capitalism, essentially, as people are taking things, taking market share. It's like clearly a very, very dangerous time. And then of course there you are representing a children's TV show, and you have your executives back in New York saying, what does this mean for our branding to be associated with a car bombing? Or, I mean, that must have led to some crazy conversations in the boardroom.
Yeah, there were some surreal, I mean, I in the book, I mean, actually, people who've read it tell me, the book's very funny because, you go.
Definitely, it's very funny.
You go from this, insane life that you're trying to navigate in Moscow, and then you come back to America and they're like, well, we're not sure if we're comfortable with this. And you're kind of like, what did you expect when you wanted to take Sesame Street to Russia? And, we had, there's one instance where we had our office taken over by soldiers with AK-47s, and they seized everything, all the scripts, all the set designs. And then the soldier reaches over, grabs our office mascot, which was like a life-size Elmo, shoves his AK-47 aside and puts Elmo under his arm and walks off. And I turned to the executive producer and I'm like, what do you think he's going to do with it? And he just shrugs and he says, he'll probably give it to his kid, But I have to say that, when we were making this show, the team consisted of about 400 Moscow artists. And these were Russians, Armenians, Ukrainians, Georgians. For some reason, a lot of the Georgians were our animators. And, you know, everybody worked together, and they were so committed and absolutely brilliant. We had brought in people from cinematography, from theater. The people who designed the set for the new neighborhood had never designed a set for television before. And so it was really like, you know, doing a moonshot. The longest TV series that had ever been produced in Russia prior to this was a 12-episode series. And we were trying to make 52 half hours.
Yeah, and I mean, you can already, I think, get an idea of the scale of the challenges that Natasha had to face and overcome in order to see this through. I mean, it's just incredible that you managed to make it.
And I'm surprised too.
You have to pinch yourself.
Yeah.
So you mentioned the collaborators. I thought, you know, it would be interesting to hear about them. And I think it's one of the book's real strengths that you talk in such a nuanced way about the kinds of people that you're working with, about the personal and career challenges that they're facing in this time of incredible upheaval. So yeah, I mean, speaking of funny, one of the great bits in the book is the epigraph to part 1 or part 2 is the head composer saying, we don't want to do any new music. We're going to have Tchaikovsky. And, you know, we don't like this idea of kind of parodies of contemporary songs. And then you have the head writer, and well, maybe you could tell us what her great line about the puppet tradition in Russia.
Yeah, no, we had, you know, when I went there, I thought, well, of course, everybody's going to love the Muppets. And boy, was I wrong. So I showed them video clips of the American Muppets and also some of the, you know, international co-production Muppets, like in Norway, Spain, Mexico. When I showed them the ones from Mexico, they said, you know, Natasha, Russia is not Mexico, like this, you know, and I thought, okay, that wasn't the point of my showing you these. And then the head writer, when I finished showing this, said, Natasha, we have our own puppetry tradition dating back to the 16th century. And it's very revered, and we really don't need your American Muppets for our Sesame Street show. And of course, I'm hired by Sesame Street, and I'm supposed to adapt the Sesame Street show, but they wanted to use wooden puppets. And there's a whole a whole section in the book about their top puppeteer who comes in and shows us his puppets, which are wooden marionettes. And he takes them out, and he has one on each hand, and they start hitting each other, you know, and then they're all laughing, and I'm just sitting here thinking, you know, I don't think this puppet on puppet violence is going to go over for your Sesame Street show. But eventually they made the creative team, after some months, made the most exquisite puppets that were, you know, even the Jim Henson Productions creators looked at Zeliboba, which is this large blue
There we are, we got a picture of Zeliboba
Muppet, and he was designed from the idea of domovoi, which is the spirit of the hearth and the home, and he protects the home. So that's what they wanted their Muppet to be. And initially he was drawn as an old man who was rather didactic. By the end of it, he was a Muppet larger than Big Bird, so more than 8 feet tall. He had was made out of blue organza and fur. And because he was at one with nature, he had pieces of moss and twigs and leaves, if you see there, sewn into his coat. And, you know, just one of the most magnificent Muppets ever created. And the Henson team that actually built him based on the designs with the Russian creative team said, you know, I loved this project because everybody knows what a frog looks like. Everybody knows, what a, if you know Kermit the Frog. But when I had this challenge, nobody knows what a tree spirit looks like. And he lived in a giant tree, which of course we had to import from America to the set.
I think we have a few more pictures of the Muppets as well. So this is Katya, who became the show's star, right? She's
the child star.
The daughter in the
and Businka is the pink puppet there, and that's our only female hand puppet. And then Kubik is he's kind of based on a Russian literature. He's sort of a ne'er-do-well, and he's always coming up with inventions that nobody's ever heard of, like a clothesline.
And actually, speaking about his inventions, there's an interesting conversation you have, right, where some of the Russians say, well, he should be constantly coming up with hopeless inventions because that would be more funny. And then there's this kind of counter view, well, is this really the message we want to be sending to children, that you'll just be laughed at if you come up with hopeless inventions? And so he gets more nuanced, and he becomes like, I think the way it works is some of his inventions actually really succeed. They turn out well.
Yeah, I mean, there was, you can imagine working with the Russian team, many of whom today, had to flee Russia in the past year because they had spoken out against the war on social media, and many of them are all over the world and thankfully being accepted into European countries, into America. And I think, this group of people that fought so hard, back then, and then continued to fight, to prevent Putin's authoritarianism and increased aggression today, it's just so heartbreaking to see, where we are today and where we were 30 years ago working together, creating Muppets. But I wanted to address, you had mentioned there were a couple of, cultural clashes, between the Americans. I mean, it wasn't only the puppets that were problematic. There were many issues, like writing the scripts it was very different. The process of writing scripts. Initially, we had children's literature writers, and they would turn in like 10 pages instead of 3. And they'd be beautifully written. You felt like you were reading, Tolstoy, but it wasn't Sesame Street comedy. And, one writer submitted a script with a storyboard, and he wanted to teach the letter D for depression. So we had a lot of training that went on where we worked together to try to create, an upbeat show that would both be true to Russia, but also, give children hope in the future. And then there were moments, for instance, with the curriculum seminar, which is the core meeting of the creative team and the educators, where they discuss the education that they want in the show. What do they want to teach their children in post-communist society? And there was this attempt to try to encourage people to understand also what is a free market. Not only democracy, voting, teaching kids, let's vote for drinking, juice or playing with crayons. And then we modeled voting, And this one, there was a discussion about how do we teach children about this new economic system, because it's so different, and they are 3 to 5 years old. So it's really challenging. And at some point early on, I said, what about a scenario where children run a lemonade stand? That will teach team building, and, they'd be dealing with money. And the whole place is silent, and they're just looking at me horrified. And they said, you mean like children selling things on the streets? And I said, yeah, just lemonade stand. And they were like, no, the only people that do that in our country are the mafia. And this was true because just a few years earlier, it was illegal. All independent commerce was illegal. So you couldn't sell things on the street. And of course, I was like, oh, yes, of course, but it was, there were many moments like this in, where I try to show how the compromise, took place, where they were able to find a way to talk about their new society in a way that was comfortable for them.
Yeah, and I think that process of like that creative process of you and the other creatives behind the program working together to find that compromise, to find that kind of common space is really for me what is such a central aspect of what makes this book so interesting, because you get there and you get there against these incredible odds and against people who just don't think it's going to happen, who can't see how like an upbeat, goofy American children's program could apply to a kind of post-Soviet society where, as you said, there's much more of a focus on like a different kind of comedy, and a comedy that's ironic and based on wordplay, and actually sees sentimentality and sees kind of belly laughing in some ways as something to be mistrustful of, something that could come across as false or overly sentimental. You quote one of my favorite Russian proverbs in the book, which is that a sign of laughter for no reason is a sign of idiocy. It's just like, it really sums up, some of the cultural challenges you have to deal with. I also just wanted to mention, just to set the scene for that curriculum seminar discussion. I mean, maybe you could tell us where was the seminar being held?
It was great. It was held at the Danilovsky Monitor, so Danilov Monastery. So this was the headquarters of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I thought this was amazing because, I thought, oh, we're doing something, it's so spiritual, to help children. But actually it was just, a place that we could afford, and they were renting out rooms. So it was the whole curriculum seminar took place during the first Chechen attack on Russian nationals in Budanovsk. And so this was going on while we were trying to discuss things like issues like nationality questions and how to have conflict resolution for preschoolers. So it was very intense.
I thought we should move on to talk about the set a little bit. So maybe we can, well, first actually to pause here, this is a wonderful picture of one of the puppeteers. Is that Kubik that he's got?
Yes.
Which I just thought was such a beautiful image, like a dancer. And you get a sense of the physical strength required as well to operate these puppets. But let's also talk about the set design. So you can see a little bit here. This is you on set with some of the team. Again, talking about finding that kind of common creative space, you've already mentioned one of the things that is definitive of how Sesame Street goes abroad is about finding a neighborhood that is the kind of heartland, the central location of the show. So maybe you could tell us about, how the search for the Russian neighborhood took place and the kinds of suggestions you had.
It was absolutely fascinating to see how my team, discussed what this neighborhood was going to look like. And the only other production that I had worked on while working for Sesame Street was Mexico. And they had a plaza, for every international co-production, there's usually a public place where people can gather. And if you know the Sesame Street set, it's based on an urban neighborhood kind of modeled on Harlem. And, the stoop, the very famous stoop, of a building, of a brownstone building, is where everybody hangs out. And in Norway, it's a train station. In South Africa, it's a marketplace. So in this case, I went to the team and I said, where would you like your neighborhood to be? And usually the neighborhood is based on some sort of realistic environment, because the idea is that children should resolve real world problems in a real life place without magic. So you don't want to have it be some sort of fantasy like environment that children would think doesn't relate to their own personal environment. So initially, the set designer went off, and then she came back, and she didn't have any drawings. And she said, I'm very confused, Natasha. I don't know what to do, because I don't know if our set should reflect pre-revolutionary Russia, our recent Soviet past, or something new that we haven't come up with yet. And, you know, it was very poignant to hear something like this. And eventually I suggested, why don't we get a group of theater directors together and let's just brainstorm this. And the idea of brainstorming, even the word does not exist in Russia. And the idea completely violates culture, Soviet culture. You mean like people you don't know necessarily come into a room and share your ideas openly?
To do your job.
Yeah, I was like, let's do it. So she didn't have a lot of faith in this process, but agreed to do it. And then we had the research director there as well, who suggested, what about a dvor, a courtyard? Because this is a traditional place which is surrounded by buildings, and then there's an archway to enter. And this existed in Soviet times, and also it could exist in the future. It existed in pre-revolutionary times as well. And it was a place where people would gather and talk. In communist times, it was also supposed to be a place where you brought together, you know, people of all different status, and they would be interacting, you know, proletariat with a doctor, a dentist, you know, these kinds of, you know, encounters. But one of the directors raised his hand and he said, so you want this to be a realistic environment, right? I said, yes, yes. And he says, oh, well, then we should have a rusty car in the courtyard and broken glass everywhere. And you should have all the neighbors reporting on their neighbors to the KGB. And he, you know, he was making a joke, but it was, you know, the whole place cracked up. But at the same time, this was the reality of what we were dealing with. How were we going to break these perceptions? What kind of place were we going to build? So the result was this, do we have a picture of the scrim here? So the backdrop, as you can see, what the set designer decided to do was to combine everything. So she had elements of pre-revolutionary Russia, Soviet buildings, Khrushchev, these old Khrushchev style, you know, cement building, concrete buildings, and then also elements of the countryside, because you had a battle going on between the city people and the rural people, as far as, you know, what is true Russia? How do we represent our Rodina, our motherland? Well, we are an agricultural society in addition to, you know, post-Stalin industrialized society, and we want the show to reflect both of those. So that's what happened, and it was beautiful, enormous set built inside the Russia's largest TV station, ORT, where I visited in January of 2020.
And just picking up on the different people in the dvor, in the courtyard, there's another really interesting exchange in the book where they're trying to work out how people should kind of call to each other, what titles they should give each other, because that, of course, has been so politicized in the previous in Russian recent history. So you had the kind of pre-revolutionary terms of deference, some of them semi-aristocratic or with a kind of politeness that didn't really seem appropriate. But then you also had comrade of the revolutionary era or in the Soviet era right the way through, and that kind of no longer feeling entirely appropriate as well. And one of the most interesting people in the book is one of your collaborators called Anna Genina, who's like a kind of cultural expert, and she kind of talks about this language limbo and not really knowing how to do some of these what seemed like quite basic things, but what carried these political charges at that time. And and the way you kind of found your way through and found compromises, maybe the wrong word, but like a practical way of creating this space for everyone, I think is one of the great achievements of the show. It's really amazing.
Thank you.
So I thought, yeah, but maybe before we go for questions, we could just talk a little bit about the show when it launched, and there's this wonderful moment when you're there at the kind of celebration dinner, and you go outside for a cigarette with your great friend Leonard, who's kind of been at your side all the way through, and you realize it's 6:05 in the evening, and you see the windows around town lighting up with the same colored lights through the glass, and you realize that a lot of these families are watching the show, which is only airing, what was it, the first time that very night?
Yeah, it was the premiere night.
I mean, maybe you could just tell us, how did it feel seeing that show actually go live, and what was the reaction that you got?
We were having a premiere celebration with all the partners who had eventually come together to broadcast the show. And the show was a huge hit from the time that it first aired. And it aired on ORT across 11 time zones, and then a second airing as well. So we were the only show in history that aired in prime time on 2 channels. And the second channel was NTV. And the show continued to air for the next 10 years, well into Putin's era. And it's been utterly amazing. I just came from London as well, and I'm meeting so many Ukrainians, Russians, because you hear Russian on the street all over the place here. It's incredible, like in Paris as well. And I'm meeting, the person working behind the cheese counter at the deli, who is Georgian and grew up on Ulitsa Sezam. And then she brought her children up on Ulitsa Sezam. And it has the same resonance in post, former USSR that Sesame Street had in America. Part of that, in all transparency, is that there really wasn't much children's television production going on then. And it took some years for other foreign TV production companies to import shows. But from when I hear the Russians and Ukrainians and people who come up to me to talk about the show, they say it's so different because that show was really about us, and it was made for us. So, I mean, one person said to me, I remember watching a Disney show as a child, and all I could focus on was the toaster, because there was, the appliances in the kitchen that I had never seen. This was like last week at the Pushkin House ceremony. And I just thought that was so amazing. You
didn't have toasters, you didn't have distracting appliances.
It wouldn't have made it into the show because the writers wouldn't have written it in. And, but the feeling of being there that night, it was snowing. And, I had just given birth to my first child.
Yeah, sorry, we didn't mention that.
Yes. So I was pregnant during the last part of the production. And I was standing there, and I just couldn't believe, watching the windows as they were changing colors, and realizing with my colleague who had been working with me for the last 5 years that they were all watching our show, that it aired. And then you saw all the colors change in unison. And it was, just the most incredible feeling. And really, I think we were all dumbfounded that it actually worked. Every person we worked with, on our team, and as I said, it was, several hundred artists. And I'm in touch with them now on WhatsApp, and have been since the war started and before, interviewing them for the book. And then I went back, as I say, in January of 2020. And, they're just so proud of it. and say, you know, this is the generation of young people who are now in their 40s and 30s. They grew up on the show. And, you know, those are the same people that have been speaking out against the war, and those who have left the country as well. And also the Ukrainians, young Ukrainians, who are fighting now for their independence. They're also the Ulitsa Sezam generation. So when I talk to them today, they all say, you know, I say, well, some people say, you know, oh, well, I guess you failed because there's war. And they say, no, how you experienced your childhood is forever important. And those same young people are still there, even if they're forced to be silent now because they can't afford to go to jail for 15 years for opposing the war, because they're taking care of elder parents or they have young children. And, you know, that generation that grew up on the show, they remember and they embraced openness and freedom a great deal with the help of the Muppets and all their own tremendous efforts.
That's a wonderful achievement. Let's throw it open for questions, because I feel sure we will have some questions in the audience.
Can we first have a big round of applause? In-person questions, and we can also go to Zoom questions.
So you said that it ran for 10 years. What did the end look like? Why has it stopped?
Great question. I tried to find that out like definitively by asking many of the people that I was interviewing in 2020. And I got some different answers, but eventually put the pieces together that there was a grab for the show by the executives who'd been put in place at ORT, the TV station. And they wanted to fire the head of research. This is Anna Genina that you had spoken about, and put in their own person. So when they did that, the rest of the team quit. And that was actually the end of the show. And that was in 2010.
My question is a very simple one. What is your background? You must have spoken Russian perfectly, fluently when you started this whole endeavor. So how did you get into this whole world of the Soviet Union at first?
Well, my grandfather is Russian, Jewish, and he left Belarusia in 1912 and immigrated to Germany and then to the United States. And I grew up, you know, hearing about this mysterious past of ours. I have 4 siblings. My sister is here tonight, and none of them speak Russian. And my parents did not speak Russian, but my grandfather did, as well as Yiddish. And in high school, I started reading Russian literature and just completely got hooked. I thought, wow, this is, you know, this mysterious, cruel place where the characters are so absurd. It really spoke to me. And I thought, maybe, what does that say about me? Right. Okay. But then I studied Russian in college and became fascinated with dictatorships. And, you know, Nazi Germany, spent a year in Asia, a good part of that in communist China, and, you know, really wanted to see it up close. So I moved to the Soviet Union when I was 22 and was part of a program. We had an American exchange program with 30 students in Moscow and 30 in St. Petersburg, Leningrad at the time. And our roommates were KGB agents in training. So there were a lot of funny stories that happened in the 1980s related to that. But I just loved it there, and then ended up making films about the underground rock and roll community, because rock was banned at the time. as well as the LGBTQ community there and persecution of homosexuals. So that was kind of how it all started. And I just kept making films until, you know, the Muppet people found me and said, we think you should be doing children's television. So, yeah. Very strange. And I went on to make more children's television after that. And, you know, I remember when they first told me about it, I looked at them and I said, I don't have children. I don't know anything about children or children's television. I'm not sure if I like children like this. And then, you know, it completely changed my life. And I feel extremely lucky because this was a moment in time. You know, we think about it now in hindsight. And we knew that this was a remarkable period, you know, the opening of Russia after, you know, from the darkness of communism. But at the same time, you know, I didn't realize it was going to be so short, and didn't realize that this was like a nanosecond of renaissance. And just, you know, the heartbreak of talking to so many people who made this, who believed that it was possible, you know. But I'm still so encouraged. You know, I saw that, you know, Khodorkovsky wrote on Twitter, you know, this war will end, Russia will change again. And that's something we know. I lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union. We do know Russia changes over and over again, and way faster than we do in the West, in our countries with, you know, in the US, 200 years plus of democracy, and in Western Europe even more. We have to take that into account. But I'm hopeful about that. Thank you so much, everybody, for coming tonight on the La Fête de la Musique, and a very hot night, so really appreciate your coming out.
Oh, a microphone. Okay. So could you talk more about how you said when you first got there was a very certain way that they did puppetry, and then how just kind of, I'm a puppeteer myself, so it's fascinating to know maybe how those puppeteers took on the change in what their art form was. Like, could you just kind of talk more about that?
Yeah, it was, you know, the puppets are completely different the way they're operated. They're also individually different. So there's the full size body puppet, you know, like Big Bird or Zeliboba, and you have to step into the costume, and then your hand goes up into the head and your hand moves the mouth like this. And one of the things is, you know, when we were auditioning for the parts, the puppeteers that were used to working with marionettes, they really didn't have the skills we were looking for. We needed like dancers and acrobats, and they had to be incredibly strong to support these puppets and hold their hand above their heads, or do it lying down or on a rolling cart, like to move with their feet like this, and they're moving the cart with their feet and holding their hands in the air. And initially it was very difficult. And they had amazing trainers from England, Nigel Plaskett, who was actually the robot in Lost in Space. And we worked with the Henson team that trained the puppeteers. They were trained in the United States with the American puppeteers as well. I mean, very extensive training. But still, I would say the stamina that it took was, we were shooting about 2 minutes a day in the beginning, and we needed to be shooting between 10 and 20 minutes a day. So when we first started, we thought, also it's very hot in the costumes, and so like yes. And so we had to stop constantly to take off Zeliboba's head so that the puppeteer could breathe. And then there were technology problems. So normally you work with the body puppet, you have a camera here, and you're able to see where you're moving by looking at the video inside the costume. But we couldn't get it to sync with the Russian equipment. So all he saw was like little blue dots. and he kept running into all the other actors, you know, and then little Katya, who you saw there, you know, he like nearly mowed her over. And so we had a lot of challenges with that, but ultimately, you know, they kept training and they got the timing of shooting up, and they did the most incredible job. Little Katya just had her second child, and she is in Moscow. And we talk on WhatsApp, and you know, things are, the exchanges are quite elliptical. And that's all I can say. But it's you know, I'd say for many of the people, especially, for instance, the chief director, who's a really famous children's cinematographer, not cinematographer, but a cinema director. And he's now in his 90s, you know, with grandchildren. And he just said, you know, my hope and my dream is that the Ulitsa Sezam generation that we helped to, you know, to grow will stop this madness.
I have one more question, which we haven't talked about. If we have time, if we can pick up from that moment as well. You know, we've talked about all of the things that you've done, but you know, you were also doing this as a single woman in Moscow by yourself through most of the time, with no family support, as you've indicated. Could you just tell us a little bit about like what it was like doing business as a single woman in Russia at that time? And curious also to hear how that compared to doing business as a single woman in New York when you were back for your board meetings as well.
Well, the 80s for a television producer or director of films was not great. And in the United States at that time, I mean, I don't think I never had a female boss, for instance, and in most cases was usually the only woman in the room. And when I got the opportunity to lead the team in Moscow, one of the, you know, I guess one of the things I told myself is I can make a difference here and I can set this up the way I want to. So we actually hired more than half of the women in key technical positions. And that had never been done in Russia before. And it worked out incredibly well. And you know, everybody got along, the male colleagues were fine with it. And the women were just blown away that we were doing that. And it really wasn't even noticed after a while. But before that, when I had been making films in Russia in the 80s, in the Soviet Union, so not only in Russia, but other parts of the former Soviet Union. And it was really a very patriarchal society. I mean, even though Russia had some very progressive policies, like they had abortion, legal abortion in the 1920s, and you could divorce your husband without him being present. I mean, both sides could, which actually benefited me at one point.
Leave that hanging.
The sequel.
But I don't know if I should go here, but anyway, when I was in my 20s, I married a gay man and tried to set up a ring of Americans marrying gay men because they were being persecuted under the Soviet system. And I thought that was a good idea at the time because, you know, we have so much freedom in America. It was during the period of AIDS. There was a lot of, you know, trying to address the same rights issues in America. But I'm very grateful that my own children have not done that, because it cost me a security clearance later when I was selected to work for the State Department. And of course, what I did was illegal. So, and I'm now past 7 years, so I think I can say that. But yeah. But anyway, you know, when I was earlier in Russia, it was very patriarchal society, and it was actually really easy to make films there because nobody took you seriously because you were a woman in a skirt, and you had to wear skirts there when you were making films. And, you know, I was able to film inside the Kirov metallurgy factory, which was a military plant. And I mean, I couldn't believe I'm, you know, with the camera in there, and I'm the guys just, you're just talking to him, but it was, you know, things like that were really possible. And it's still a very patriarchal society. You know, you look at any pictures of Putin's regime, how many women do you see in the government?
Thank you. We have a question.
Thank you. My question is about the financing of the show, and so the Congress was partially financing the show.
Yes.
And how long did that last, and how much, like, what was the mandate? Like, how much control did they have on the content?
The Congress appropriated the funding, and it was contingent on us matching the funding with Russian money. And the funding would not be released until you had a commitment from the Russian side. So their actual creative control in anything we were doing was zero, absolutely zero. So they appropriated the money to Sesame Workshop, which was then called Children's Television Workshop. And essentially, we worked with the team in Moscow, the creative team and the educators, to determine what the show was going to look like. And we sent reports back, you know, with financial information of what we were spending. But there were many complications because there were no Western banks at the time in Russia. And so it was very complicated to get money into the country. And I write about that as well. And, you know, we had amazing partners. We had eventually my counterpart was a woman, one of the only women to own an advertising and production company in Russia at the time. So we had this amazing, you know, high-powered, you know, estrogen team that was, and most of our funding, you know, went through their company as well.